I've often been asked, can the orb transpose its pattern it's playing via a MIDI keyboard connected? And the question is no, not by itself. But in this example, I'd like to show you how you can play the excess with the orb sequencer, yet use a MIDI keyboard to control the transposition at the exact same time. So let's look at our setup here. We've got the CV output of the orb connected into the CV input of the excess. In our CV track control, we've selected ABX, which means both oscillator A and B will be getting their control information from the orb via the CV input. We've got the CV output connected into the oscillator modulation section. And so in the oscillator modulation section for each oscillator, we're going to select external. And what that's doing is MIDI notes coming in from the MIDI keyboard are being converted into a CV output. That CV output's going into this section to modulate the oscillator. So that's going to sum together the pitches coming from the orb via CV and the pitches coming from MIDI keyboard being generated into CV and coming in this way. So now we'll have two voltages summing together to control both oscillators. The trick with this is you need to set up the A amount and B amount for each oscillator so that our CV output here is producing a 1 volt per octave standard. If you're familiar with the old EMS or EML or even an ARP 2600, a lot of those keyboards had like this scaling control for their keyboards that allowed you to adjust the span of the keyboard and the control voltage that it generated, which is always kind of a problem to set up, but once you got it, you could do not only standard tunings but other tunings as well. So it's good to know this because you can stretch the scale a little bit. And let's say you wanted to use one oscillator tracking your typical 1 volt per octave and the other oscillator slightly off just to create some intermodulations or discordant sounds, which might be good when you're using the ring modulator or something else. So now what we need to do, we've got our MIDI out of our MIDI controller plugged into the MIDI input, and you'll notice that when I press a note on the MIDI keyboard, doesn't matter what note I'm playing, we're not getting any tracking. So let's turn up oscillator A, its level in the mixer. And the other thing I should say is you need to use the lowest key range of your MIDI controller as your base reference point. So C1, that should be this note here. This note should be C2. So as I adjust this amount, you'll notice you're just hearing a slight little detuning, which you're going to get just because of the offset of the MIDI to CV converter. But let's go ahead and play C2 now and increase this. Now we hear some change happening. So now what we need to do is alternate between playing C1 and C2 to produce roughly an octave. That sounds about right. Actually, it sounds just about right turned all the way up, so let's check all our octaves here. Alright, now let's go ahead and turn oscillator A down, or actually we can leave it up and just increase oscillator B's level and adjust the B amount for oscillator B. Okay, so now both oscillators are tracking. You'll notice though, if we back this off to some other setting, oscillator B's scale is going to be attenuated from what it normally is, and you're going to hear beatings happening between the oscillators, which can be useful for certain techniques. But let's go ahead and turn this up so they're both tracking the same pitch. Now another thing I would say is you can back off just a little bit and create just a little bit of chorusing if you like between the oscillators, but let's go ahead and try to get them to track in unison. So now let's start playback on our sequencer, and let's see here. Oh, we're not getting anything happening, and that's because the gate output of the orb is not plugged into the gate input. You need to disconnect that while you're doing your tracking setting for oscillator A and B. Otherwise, if you plug something into the gate input here, it won't allow MIDI to play that gate in. So now, if we start playback on the orb, we've got our sequence playing by the orb, and now as we hit keys on the keyboard, we should be able to transpose that pattern. Now, this pattern doesn't have any glide set, so let's go in here and we'll place a couple glides. Maybe the quarter notes. Now let's listen to that. So now the orb is causing those notes to glide based on this glide time. But another trick we can do is, since MIDI is coming in and this glide time controls the glide time of notes from the MIDI keyboard, we can adjust this glide time, set a short glide time on the orb, and now our transpositions on the MIDI keyboard can also be glided to some other time. This might be more obvious if we just pick a simple pattern, like here we're playing octaves. Now let's go ahead and use this glide time to glide the transposition. So if I hit notes individually, but if I hold a note and press another note, then we're going to get the auto glide from the excess. So there's a lot of different techniques you can use to combine and get different results using this method, but it works great. You've got a sequencer that's playing, you've got a MIDI keyboard that is able to transpose. The only drawback to this method is now you've lost any sort of frequency modulation you might want to do between the oscillators. If that's something you want to do to create more complex sounds, you would need an external module that is basically acting like a simple little mixer, but applying it to DC and not AC signals. And then you'd run your CV output into the mixer, as well as, let's say, oscillator A into the mixer, send that output into oscillator B's external modulation, so you could modulate oscillator B with oscillator A and vice versa. Just another way you can expand the possibilities using a larger modular system.